Their wedding. Maid of honor stood up and said she's pregnant with her billionaire husband's child. Part 3. Every step Natalie takes down the aisle feels deliberate, grounded, certain. There is no rush in her movements, no tension in her shoulders, no tightness in her breath. This time, nothing is chasing her forward. The room is quiet in a way that feels safe, not the kind of silence that warns you something is about to break, but the kind that holds you steady, the kind that lets you breathe. This moment looks familiar, and yet it isn't. Not because of the flowers, not because of the guests, but because of who Natalie has become standing inside it. Before, she walked with hope mixed with uncertainty, love mixed with trust she hadn't yet learned how to protect. Now she walks with clarity. This isn't the wedding she once imagined late at night when everything still felt simple. It's better than that. This wasn't the wedding they planned. It was the wedding they earned. And as she lifts her eyes and sees Richie waiting for her, steady, present, unguarded, she knows something with quiet certainty. Nothing here is being guessed anymore. Nothing here is being hidden, and nothing about this moment is fragile. She isn't stepping into a promise she doesn't understand. She is stepping into a choice, fully aware of what it took to arrive here. Before we go any further, the truth deserves to be said plainly, not emotionally, not defensively, but clearly. Richie never betrayed her. There was no affair, no secret life, no crossed boundary that night people still talk about, and the child at the center of the storm, the one whose name shattered a celebration, was never his. Those facts existed long before this moment, even when fear buried them under silence and confusion. They were true even when no one knew how to say them out loud. Truth doesn't arrive loudly. It doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it waits patiently for people to become ready for it. And when it finally speaks, it doesn't erase what was lost, but it does change what's possible. So if you're here still holding questions from before, still wondering what was real and what wasn't, you can set that weight down now. Nothing about this moment is built on misunderstanding. Nothing here depends on denial. This story didn't survive because lies were convincing. It survived because the truth refused to disappear. And everything that follows, every step, every vow, every breath Natalie takes right now, stands firmly on that ground. You might remember how it ended the first time. The sudden quiet, the uncertain glances, the sound that felt too small to carry so much weight. That moment mattered, but it was never meant to be the ending. What people often miss is this: the most important chapters of a love story rarely happen in public. They happen afterward, when the room empties, when opinions get loud, when two people are left alone with what they feel and what they fail to say. That's where this story changed direction. Not with grand speeches, not with explanations shouted over emotion, but through long pauses, difficult honesty, and the slow understanding of what silence had cost them both. Pain didn't erase the love between Natalie and Richie. It clarified it, and clarity has a way of removing fear without making noise. This moment, this calm, steady return, didn't happen because time passed. It happened because truth stayed. What you're witnessing now isn't a restart, it's a continuation, written by people who know exactly what almost broke them and chose to stand anyway, just like Natalie is walking now. Have you ever loved someone twice? Once when everything felt light, when hope came easily and the future looked simple, and once again after disappointment, when love had to stand on understanding instead of expectation. That second kind of love is quieter. It doesn't rush forward. It listens before it speaks. Natalie didn't return to this day because she forgot what hurt her. She returned because she finally understood what never disappeared. Love hadn't failed them. Fear had interrupted it. And silence had delayed it. What came back between them wasn't a feeling fighting to survive. It was a decision made with open eyes. That's the difference now. She isn't walking toward a promise she hopes will work. She's walking toward a future she already recognizes. And when Richie meets her gaze, there's no urgency there. Only patience. Only peace. Because love, when it comes back honestly, doesn't need to convince anyone. It simply arrives and stays. Healing never happens all at once. It doesn't come rushing back the moment answers appear. It comes in pieces, carried by consistency, reinforced by effort, strengthened by time. Natalie didn't wake up suddenly ready to trust again, and Richie didn't expect that she would. What changed wasn't the pace of healing. It was how gently they walked through it together. There were conversations that didn't need defending, moments that didn't need proof, silences that felt comfortable instead of frightening. That was new. Before, silence had carried fear. Now, it carried understanding. Richie didn't try to rewrite the past or soften what had happened. He stood exactly where honesty asked him to stand, present, steady, unchanged. And Natalie noticed. Not in some dramatic realization, but in small, ordinary moments that felt safe again. The kind you only recognize after you've missed them. Healing didn't ask them to forget. It asked them to grow. And growth, when shared, becomes something stronger than hope. It returns with memory, with awareness, with presence. Nothing about this moment is accidental. Every step Natalie takes now is informed by everything she survived. Not weighed down by it, but strengthened by it. She isn't hoping love will be enough this time. She already knows what it can and cannot carry. That knowledge brings peace. This love doesn't lean on promises spoken quickly or emotions running ahead of reality. It stands quietly on what has already been proven: patience, honesty, consistency. Richie doesn't reach for reassurance. He doesn't search her face for certainty. He trusts the process that brought them here. And Natalie feels that. The calm in her chest isn't excitement trying to convince itself to be brave. It's alignment. This moment isn't trying to fix the past. It's honoring the present. And that is why it holds, after misunderstanding, after hard truths spoken later than they should have been. Love found its way back. Not dramatically, not urgently, but honestly. What returned between Natalie and Richie wasn't the innocence they once had. It was something steadier, a kind of love that knows how easily things can break and still chooses to stand. There is relief in that knowledge, freedom in no longer guessing. This love doesn't need to protect itself with distance or doubt. It doesn't need to rush forward out of fear of slipping away. It's secure enough to wait, strong enough to stay, and standing here now, with everyone gathered not in suspense but in peace, Natalie understands something clearly. Love didn't survive despite the truth. It survived because of it. So let me ask you something gently, right here in this moment. What would you do if love came back to you? Not asking you to forget, not asking you to pretend, but simply asking you to move forward with clear eyes. Would you recognize it? Natalie did. Not because everything was perfect, but because nothing was uncertain anymore. She isn't replaying old pain in her mind as she stands here. She isn't bracing herself for disappointment. Her heart isn't racing out of fear. It's steady. That steadiness is what tells her this is real. Love doesn't always announce itself with intensity. Sometimes it arrives quietly and stays because it finally belongs exactly where it is. This isn't a leap of faith anymore. It's a decision, calm, confident, and complete. And standing in that truth, Natalie doesn't wonder if this will last. She already knows why it will. This is not a story about pretending pain never existed. It's a story about refusing to let pain write the ending. Everything that once felt fragile now feels anchored. Every promise waiting to be spoken has already been tested by time, honesty, and restraint. Nothing here is rushed. Nothing here is accidental. The joy in this room isn't loud because it doesn't need to prove itself. It's steady because it's secure. Natalie isn't standing here hoping love will carry her. She knows it will. Richie isn't promising who he thinks he can be. He's standing as who he already is. And that is what makes this moment feel different from the last time. Not the setting, not the witnesses, but the certainty underneath it all. This isn't about correcting a past mistake. It's about honoring what survived it. So stay here for the rest of this story. Stay not because you're waiting for answers, but because this ending was shaped patiently, honestly, and with care. If you followed this journey from the beginning, this moment exists because you stayed through the hardest parts. And if this is your first time listening, welcome. You've arrived at the chapter where love speaks last, not over confusion, not over fear, but with clarity. This time, nothing is being hidden. Nothing is being rushed. Nothing is left unfinished. Love didn't come back asking for permission. It came back ready. So stay with the family. Subscribe if you haven't already. And let the rest of this story remind you of something simple and powerful. When love survives truth, it survives completely. It didn't begin with a conversation about what went wrong, and it didn't begin with an attempt to fix anything. It began quietly, so quietly that neither of them recognized it as a beginning at all. Natalie noticed him the way you notice something familiar before you consciously acknowledge it. A presence in a space she already occupied, a shape that didn't startle her, didn't raise alarm, didn't disrupt her breath, just there. They crossed paths at a small cafe neither of them had chosen intentionally. It was simply part of routine now, a stop between errands, a place that didn't carry memory or expectation. Natalie had already ordered when she turned and saw Richie standing several feet away, waiting his turn, hands relaxed at his sides. Their eyes met briefly. There was no shock, no stiffness, no instinct to retreat, just recognition. "Hi," he said softly, like he didn't want to disturb something fragile. "Hi," Natalie replied, and the word surprised her by how naturally it came. They didn't rush into conversation. They didn't rush away either. They stood there for a moment longer than necessary, both aware of time passing, neither feeling the need to escape it. They spoke about simple things, how early the morning felt, how busy the street had become lately, how strange it was that the seasons always seemed to change without asking permission. Ordinary observations, nothing heavy, nothing loaded. That mattered. Natalie noticed how her shoulders stayed relaxed the entire time, how her mind didn't race ahead, searching for meaning or warning signs. She wasn't rehearsing responses or preparing herself emotionally. She was simply present. Richie noticed something too. He wasn't measuring his words. He wasn't watching her face for signs of discomfort. He was just talking. That ease startled him a little, not because it felt wrong, but because it felt like something he hadn't expected to be allowed again. And yet here it was, settling between them without resistance. When their orders were ready, there was no dramatic pause, no question hanging in the air. They exchanged a few final words, nodded naturally, and headed toward separate exits. Neither of them looked back. But later that day, Natalie realized something had shifted. She replayed the moment not because it hurt, but because it hadn't. The encounter hadn't stirred anxiety. It hadn't reopened wounds. It hadn't sent her spiraling into old questions. It had simply existed and ended. That surprised her more than anything else could have. Over the next few days, this pattern repeated itself, not identically, not intentionally, just gently. A shared sidewalk, a brief conversation at a mutual acquaintances gathering, a moment of quiet acknowledgement that didn't require explanation. What struck Natalie was how little effort it took to exist in those moments. She wasn't bracing herself. She wasn't armoring her emotions. She wasn't pretending strength. She was simply herself. And Richie, in those same moments, felt something he hadn't allowed himself to name yet. A sense that he didn't need to prove anything right now. He didn't need to correct the past with urgency. He didn't need to fill space with intention. He just needed to show up as he was. No pressure followed these moments. No text messages dissecting what they meant. No assumptions rushed forward. They let the moments stand on their own. And that was the quiet beginning, not marked by decisions or declarations, but by ease, by the absence of fear, by the steady realization that nothing about these encounters felt forced or fragile. Love didn't announce its return. It slipped back in through the ordinary. The laughter came back when neither of them was looking for it. It wasn't invited. It wasn't planned. It didn't wait for permission. It showed up in the middle of an ordinary moment, a comment made without much thought, a small observation that didn't mean to be funny, and then suddenly it was there. Light, familiar, easy. Natalie laughed before she realized she was doing it. The sound surprised her. Not because it felt inappropriate, but because it felt untouched. The laughter wasn't careful. It didn't hesitate. It didn't check for safety. It arrived the same way it always had, warm and genuine, rising out of comfort rather than relief. Richie noticed immediately, not just the laughter, but what it didn't carry. There was no edge to it, no tension hiding underneath. It wasn't fragile or forced or trying to reassure itself that existence was allowed. It was simply joy finding room again. They stood there for a moment afterward, the air between them calm, neither rushing to say something else to fill the space. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It didn't demand explanation. It felt earned. Natalie caught herself smiling faintly even after the laughter faded. Not out of sentimentality, not because she was replaying memories, but because the moment had felt genuine, uncomplicated, real. That mattered more than she expected. In the days that followed, laughter surfaced again in small ways. Shared observations, a familiar habit Richie still had of shaking his head when something amused him. Natalie pointing something out the way she always had, without softening her tone or guarding her words. It wasn't a return to the past, it was recognition. They both felt it, that subtle shift where interaction stopped feeling cautious and started feeling familiar again, not reckless, not overly sentimental, comfortable. Natalie noticed something else too. She wasn't analyzing these moments afterward. She wasn't lying awake replaying them, searching for meaning, wondering what they should lead to. She wasn't tightening her chest around the idea that enjoying herself meant she was rushing ahead emotionally. She let the moments exist as they were. Richie did the same. He didn't reach for closeness. He didn't hint at intention. He didn't turn laughter into leverage. He let it be shared, not owned. There was freedom in that restraint, even if neither of them named it that way. Each moment stood on its own, complete without needing to point forward or backward. What surprised them both was how quickly the effort disappeared. They didn't have to calculate timing or tone. They didn't have to phrase sentences carefully or monitor each other's reactions. The ease that returned between them didn't feel built, it felt uncovered, as if laughter had been there all along, waiting for space. Natalie recognized the shift quietly one evening as she walked home afterward. She wasn't replaying words, she wasn't trying to interpret expression or inflection. She was simply calm. That absence of emotional noise told her more than any conversation could have. She didn't feel like she was protecting herself anymore. She felt like she was present. Richie felt something similar, a sense that he didn't need to reach ahead of the moment to secure it. He trusted that if something was real, it would remain without pressure. If it belonged, it wouldn't disappear just because he allowed it room. That trust softened everything, and so the laughter continued, not loud, not constant, but steady enough to remind them both of something simple and deeply reassuring. Joy hadn't been lost. It had only been quiet. The memories came back slowly, and when they did, they didn't hurt. Natalie noticed it first during a simple conversation that drifted into the past without either of them steering it there. Richie mentioned a place they used to go, not with intention, not nostalgically, just as part of a story, a detail, nothing more. Natalie felt her body respond before her thoughts did. There was no tightening in her chest, no pull inward, no need to look away. Instead, there was warmth. She realized then that the memories no longer carried weight. They didn't place demands on her. They didn't ask her to relive or repair or explain. They simply existed, complete, settled, and unthreatening. That surprised her. For a long time, memories had felt sharp, like reminders she hadn't asked for. But now, those same moments felt different, softer, finished. They no longer pointed to loss. They pointed to something that had been real, something that hadn't been imagined or misunderstood. Richie noticed the shift at the same time, though he didn't speak it out loud. He felt it in the way Natalie listened without guarding herself, in how she smiled without hesitation when something familiar resurfaced. There was no flinch. That mattered more than reassurance ever could. They talked about moments that once defined their connection, not with longing, not with regret, but with a shared understanding that those moments belonged honestly to both of them. Nothing felt stolen from the present by acknowledging the past. No one tried to correct anything. No one rushed to say, that was before. The memories didn't demand separation between then and now. They simply connected them. Natalie realized something quietly as she listened to Richie speak. Those memories had never been the problem. They hadn't caused the pain. They hadn't failed her. What had hurt wasn't what they shared. It was what went unsaid. And now that silence no longer existed between them. That understanding changed how she held the past. She didn't need to push it away or keep it locked somewhere unreachable. It could rest comfortably, where it belonged, behind her, but not buried. Richie felt something similar settle inside him. He realized he didn't need to distance himself from those memories either. He didn't need to treat them as reminders of what he'd lost or what he'd failed to protect. They weren't evidence against him. They were proof of something that had survived complexity. When Natalie laughed at something he remembered clearly, a small habit of hers, a familiar reaction, it didn't sting. It felt affirming, like the bond they shared had always been rooted deeper than misunderstanding ever reached. There was no tension in the space between them as these moments unfolded. No sense that remembering meant revisiting pain. The past wasn't asking for an explanation anymore. It felt complete. Natalie began to trust what she felt in those moments, not as nostalgia, not as hope, but as recognition. The kind that doesn't argue or convince. The kind that simply knows. She wasn't being pulled backward. She wasn't slipping forward either. She was standing in something that felt whole. Richie sensed that wholeness as well. He felt steadier in her presence, not because he expected something from it, but because it asked nothing of him except honesty. That ease carried forward, and with each shared memory that landed without pain, something quiet became clear to them both. Love had never been erased. It had been waiting to be understood without fear. What surprised them most wasn't how much they still understood each other. It was how little explaining was required. There was no moment where either of them asked, "Are we okay now?" No conversation that tried to define what they were rebuilding. It wasn't avoidance, it was trust. Natalie noticed how easily she spoke her thoughts without softening them. She didn't feel the need to protect herself with distance or caution. She wasn't measuring how much of herself was allowed in each interaction. She was simply being seen and not questioned for it. Richie sensed the same quiet shift. He wasn't scanning her reactions anymore, worried that a wrong word might undo everything. He wasn't rehearsing honesty or trying to prove consistency through effort. He was present, and that was enough. Their conversations flowed in a way only familiar bonds do, one thought picking up where the other left off. Small pauses filled without discomfort, shared understanding replacing explanations. Nothing had been announced, nothing had been negotiated. They moved together at the same pace without needing to agree on it first. Natalie felt something release inside her during one of those moments, an awareness that she wasn't bracing for disappointment anymore. She wasn't preparing herself emotionally or holding part of herself back just in case. That readiness to stay fully present told her more than any promise ever could. She wasn't choosing to trust again because she felt obligated to. She trusted because it felt natural. Richie noticed how she no longer pulled away when conversations grew quiet. Silence didn't make her tense. It didn't trigger a need to change subjects or retreat emotionally. She allowed space without fear now, and that told him everything. Peace didn't have to be proved. It could be felt. Neither of them tried to rush toward a future timeline. There were no assumptions layered onto moments that didn't ask for them. Each interaction stood complete on its own, without pressure to become something else. It felt mature, balanced. Natalie realized that what made this different from before wasn't just clarity. It was alignment. They weren't trying to lead or follow each other. They were simply walking side by side. Even when they disagreed, it didn't crack the calm between them. Differences didn't threaten connection anymore. They trusted the foundation beneath the conversation. That trust was new, and Richie felt relief in it. The kind that comes when you no longer feel responsible for managing someone's emotions or shielding them from reality. He didn't need to anticipate, fear, or minimize truth. Honesty lived easily between them now. None of this felt dramatic. There was no rush of emotion or overwhelming certainty announcing itself. The shift was subtle but unmistakable. Love wasn't asking to be defined. It was asking to be lived. Natalie recognized that she no longer wondered if this would fall apart. Not because she believed nothing could go wrong, but because she knew they would face whatever came openly. She didn't need guarantees, she needed authenticity, and for the first time in a long while, everything between them felt uncomplicated in the best possible way. The realization didn't arrive with certainty spoken out loud. It arrived quietly, the way understanding often does when it no longer needs to defend itself. Natalie noticed it one afternoon when they were sitting together without conversation leading the moment. There was no topic guiding them, no purpose attached to the time they shared. They were simply there, aware of each other, content in the absence of words. And for the first time, Natalie felt no internal resistance. She wasn't checking herself for caution. She wasn't reminding herself to stay guarded. She wasn't negotiating how much closeness was allowed. That absence of tension told her everything. The energy she once carried, the alertness, the quiet preparation for disappointment, had faded completely. What remained felt steady, settled, and grounded in trust rather than hope. She looked at Richie without needing to search his face. She already recognized what was there. Richie sensed the shift too, even without knowing exactly when it had happened. He noticed it in the way Natalie leaned into conversations instead of holding back, in the way she no longer moved through moments with quiet restraint. She trusted herself again, and that allowed her to trust him fully. There was no grand admission, no emotional declaration marking the realization. It didn't need to be named out loud because it didn't feel uncertain or fragile. Love hadn't left them at any point. It had simply been obscured by confusion and silence, not extinguished, not replaced. That understanding held peace. Natalie realized she had stopped measuring her feelings against past pain. She wasn't comparing the present to what had gone wrong or calculating whether joy would last. Each moment stood on its own, complete and uninterrupted. That was new territory. For Richie, the realization carried responsibility rather than relief. He understood now what it meant to be trusted again, not as a reward, not as forgiveness spoken into motion, but as something quietly restored through reliability and openness. He didn't take it lightly. He remained the same in every moment. No shifting tone, no change in effort, no sudden intensity now that closeness had returned. He stayed consistent in the ways that mattered most. Natalie noticed that consistency, even when she wasn't looking for it. It showed up in the ease of shared time, in the honesty of silence, in the safety of knowing nothing was being hidden anymore. That truth softened something deep inside her. One evening, Natalie caught herself smiling alone afterward, not replaying the day but feeling settled by it. The calm followed her home without effort. She wasn't waiting for something else to happen. She felt complete in the present. Richie felt it too, the shift from patience to presence. He no longer felt like he was standing at a distance waiting his turn. He was simply there again, fully involved, fully known. Neither of them rushed to name what they were rebuilding. They didn't need to. The reality was already clear. They weren't returning to each other out of familiarity. They were choosing each other again, not emotionally driven, not impulsive, but with full understanding of who they were now. And that choice didn't feel dramatic. It felt right. From that point on, nothing needed to be forced. Natalie and Richie didn't return to one another through declarations or rehearsed conversations. There was no moment where they sat down to define what was happening or where it should lead. The clarity they shared made definition unnecessary. They continued showing up in the same quiet ways. Shared meals that felt unremarkable in the best sense. Walks taken without direction. Evenings spent talking until the conversation naturally faded into silence. And silence no longer felt like absence. It felt full. Natalie noticed how her body responded now when she was around him, not with anticipation or hesitation, but with ease. The calm followed her even after they parted. There was no emotional drop, no sense of something unfinished pulling at her. She felt grounded. Richie experienced the same steadiness. He no longer felt like he was proving that he belonged there. He belonged not because of anything he said or did in a single moment, but because his presence was consistent over time. That consistency had become its own language. Neither of them rushed the future forward. They didn't speak about what would happen next or when something should change. They trusted that what felt settled now didn't need acceleration. Trust grows best when it isn't hurried. Natalie realized something quietly during one of those ordinary afternoons. She had stopped thinking of love as something fragile. She no longer imagined it as something that could shatter with one misstep or one difficult conversation. Love felt durable now, not invincible, but capable. And that realization brought relief. She wasn't holding herself ready to protect her heart anymore. She was allowing it to exist without tension. That freedom was new, and she welcomed it without question. Richie noticed the way Natalie moved through moments with him now, without reservation, without distance. Her laughter remained easy. Her silences remained open. Nothing about her behavior asked him to guess where he stood, and so he stood naturally, without fear of losing ground. They didn't need reminders of what they had overcome. They didn't need to revisit pain to validate healing. What they shared now spoke clearly for itself. Love had returned, not as something desperate for attention, but as something stable enough to wait. and as they continued forward together day by day, it became clear to them both that this rebuilding wasn't fragile or conditional. It was solid. What once felt uncertain had resolved itself through time, presence, and honesty. Nothing remained unresolved between them. Nothing lingered unsaid. They weren't rebuilding something new. They were stepping back into something true, stronger because it had been tested, sound because it had been understood. And without ceremony or declaration, Natalie and Richie recognized the same truth. Love hadn't been lost. It had been paused. Now it was moving forward again, calmly, confidently, and without doubt. Georgiana didn't arrive at the truth suddenly. It came slowly, not as relief, but as weight. There were moments after everything settled, after the noise quieted, and people stopped asking questions, when she was left alone with what she had done. No one accusing her, no one demanding answers, just quiet days that carried memory whether she invited them or not. She replayed the moment that changed everything, not the words she said, but the result they carried. The way faces shifted, the way hope collapsed all at once, the way something beautiful fractured publicly because fear had spoken before courage did, and for the first time, she stopped trying to explain herself to herself. She stopped saying she was confused. She stopped leaning on panic as justification. She stopped softening the truth. What she had done wasn't loud aggression. It wasn't cruelty fueled by intention. It was something quieter and harder to accept. She had spoken out of fear without considering the damage her words would inflict. And in doing so, she had taken something from Natalie that could not be returned. Choice. Georgiana understood then that what she destroyed wasn't just a moment or a celebration. It wasn't just trust between friends. It was the right to face truth privately, with dignity, without being forced into shock in front of others. That realization pressed heavily on her chest. She hadn't meant to break something sacred, but intention didn't soften consequence. For days she carried the urge to reach out, not to defend herself, not to ask for forgiveness, but to speak truthfully without protecting her own comfort. She resisted the impulse to rush apology forward, knowing that words alone wouldn't repair the harm she'd caused. What she owed Natalie was more than regret. She owed effort. That awareness changed something in her. Instead of focusing on how to be forgiven, Georgiana began asking a different question. What does responsibility look like when damage is already done? The answer wasn't obvious. It didn't come in clean steps or prepared gestures. But one truth became clear. Healing wasn't something Natalie owed her. It was something Georgiana had to contribute to, without expectation. And that meant action, not symbolic, not performative, but deliberate. She began with silence, not avoidance, but restraint. She stopped telling her version of the story to others. She let perception settle where it would. She allowed discomfort to remain unanswered. That was part of it. In quiet moments, Georgiana acknowledged the depth of what had been lost because of her fear. She didn't frame herself as irreparable or hopeless, but she also didn't minimize the scale of her impact. For the first time, she looked honestly at her role, not as a mistake made under pressure, but as a choice made in weakness. And once she saw it clearly, something shifted. She didn't want to remain frozen at the point of harm. She wanted to move forward, not ahead of Natalie's healing, but alongside it in whatever way Natalie allowed. That desire wasn't desperate, it was resolute. Georgiana accepted that she might never be close to Natalie again the way she once was. But closeness was no longer the goal. Restoration was. She didn't want to erase what she had broken. She wanted to help rebuild what could still stand. And with that understanding settled firmly in place, Georgiana made her decision. Not impulsively, not emotionally, but with calm determination. When the time came, she would speak. Not to defend herself, not to justify fear, but to offer something different, to say plainly and without condition that she was ready to help rebuild what she had once damaged, even if the effort changed nothing for her in return. The moment Georgiana chose to act, she also chose restraint. She didn't reach for Natalie immediately. She knew that urgency, even when well-intended, could feel like pressure, and pressure had already taken enough from Natalie. Instead, Georgiana waited for clarity inside herself first. She asked hard questions, not about forgiveness, but about responsibility. What did repair actually look like when the damage couldn't be undone? What could be offered without demanding anything in return? The answer wasn't another message filled with remorse. Natalie had already heard words What she hadn't received was proof that Georgiana understood the depth of what she had taken, so Georgiana began small. She handled what she could quietly. She corrected misinformation when it reached her without drawing attention. She removed herself from spaces where her presence might reopen wounds. She resisted the urge to be seen doing better, choosing instead to be better without audience. Accountability, she learned, didn't need witnesses. At night, she replayed the friendship as it once had been, the ease, the trust, the sense of safety Natalie had offered without question. It hurt to acknowledge that she had been careless with something that had never been fragile. That awareness didn't crush her, it steadied her. Weeks later, when she finally reached out, it wasn't dramatic. One message, honest, precise, unemotional. There's something I need to say to you, not to explain myself, not to ask for forgiveness. Only to be clear. Natalie didn't respond immediately, and Georgiana expected that. Patience was part of repair. When the reply finally came, it was brief. We can talk. They met in a quiet place, neutral ground chosen without symbolism. No history layered into the walls. No expectations lingering in the air. Natalie arrived composed, not guarded, not cold, simply present in herself. Georgiana didn't sit too close. She didn't reach out instinctively. She didn't try to soften the moment with familiarity that no longer belonged to her. She spoke carefully. I spent a long time understanding what I actually did, she said. Not just what happened, but what I took from you. Natalie listened without interrupting. I took your right to face truth on your own terms, Georgiana continued. I made fear speak before respect, and no apology fixes that. Natalie nodded slightly, acknowledging the accuracy of the words, not accepting them, just registering them. Then Georgiana said the thing she had come to say. I don't want forgiveness if it costs you anything, and I don't expect closeness again. But if there's a way to help, truly help, build something healthy where harm once existed, I want to offer that. Natalie inhaled slowly. Georgiana met her eyes fully now. No expectation, no pleading. Let me help build what I once broke, she said softly. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable. It was honest. Natalie didn't answer right away, not because she was deciding whether, but because she was checking why. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm. I won't accept help out of obligation, she said, and I won't reopen myself if it undermines my peace. Georgiana nodded. I understand. Natalie studied her for a moment longer. But I believe people can grow, she added, and I believe healing isn't only personal. Sometimes it's shared, carefully. She paused. If I accept this, Natalie said, it's because it serves my healing, not because it eases your guilt. Georgiana didn't hesitate. That's how it should be. That was the moment things shifted, not because trust was restored, but because truth was no longer defended. Natalie wasn't inviting the past back in. She was allowing space for repair without surrendering control. And Georgiana understood that the role she was stepping into wasn't one of closeness or recognition. It was one of contribution. Repair, she learned, wasn't about being welcomed. It was about being useful, without needing reward. Natalie didn't tell anyone right away. Not Richie, not her parents, not even herself, fully, because accepting Georgiana's offer hadn't closed something. It had opened a careful door, one that required reflection before movement. She carried the conversation with her quietly, letting it sit without pressure to resolve into action. There was no urgency to involve anyone else yet. This was about internal alignment before external change. Natalie asked herself honest questions. Would allowing Georgiana to contribute bring peace or complication? Would accepting help reopen old wounds or demonstrate that healing didn't require exclusion? The answers didn't arrive instantly, but one feeling remained consistent: control. Natalie felt in control of the decision, and that mattered more than certainty. When she eventually spoke to Richie about it, the moment was calm and deliberate. They weren't in the middle of anything emotional. There was no heightened energy pulling the conversation forward. I met with her, Natalie said simply. Richie didn't react. He didn't ask questions automatically or jump to opinion. He waited. She didn't explain herself, Natalie continued. She didn't ask for forgiveness. She offered to help, if it served my healing. Richie absorbed this carefully. And how did that feel to you? He asked. Natalie considered the question. It felt honest, she said. Not comfortable, but honest. Richie nodded slowly. Then I trust you. There was no resistance in his voice. No need to protect Natalie from something she was choosing consciously. That trust landed deeply. Later, when Georgiana began to help, it wasn't public. It wasn't framed as redemption or repair. She stayed entirely behind the scenes, her involvement subtle and precise. She researched logistics without being asked, made calls without attaching her name, offered ideas only when invited. She didn't attempt emotional closeness. She didn't ask for reassurance. Her focus stayed narrow, contribute value, disappear when done. Natalie noticed. Healing wasn't happening loudly, but it was happening steadily. There were moments when Natalie felt the familiar tension surface, flashes of the hurt she hadn't forgotten, but now the pain didn't control direction. It existed without dominance. Each responsible action Georgiana took eased something quietly, not memory, but weight. Natalie understood now that accountability wasn't about reversal. Nothing could be undone, but effort could be redirected, and effort, when consistent, created safety. One afternoon, after a small but meaningful task was completed, no discussion, no acknowledgement requested, Natalie felt something release inside her. Not forgiveness, acceptance. The kind that doesn't erase the past, but no longer argues with it. She realized then that choosing to accept help hadn't weakened her boundaries. It had clarified them. This wasn't about reconciliation or restoring old closeness. It was about allowing someone who had caused harm to actively support healing, without rewriting history. Georgiana remained respectful of space. She never inserted herself into decision-making. She waited for guidance instead of assuming permission. That restraint mattered. Richie observed the same shift. He saw how Natalie moved more freely, unburdened by unresolved edges. He didn't interfere, and he didn't question the process. Love didn't require him to shield Natalie now. It required him to trust the strength she had earned. As all of this unfolded, something unexpected became clear to all three of them. The damage that had once seemed defining was no longer central. Healing had moved the story forward, not by revisiting the wound, but by changing how everyone related to it. And Georgiana, once the source of disruption, had become something else. Not redeemed, not restored, but responsible. And in that responsibility, Natalie found peace rather than tension. That was the turning point. Not a moment of reunion, not a declaration, just alignment. Georgiana understood something clearly now. Repair required endurance, not enthusiasm, not big gestures. Endurance. She stayed consistent over time, even when there was no feedback to guide her. Tasks were handled quietly. Decisions were respected without commentary. When her role wasn't required, she stepped back without visible disappointment. Natalie noticed the discipline in that. It would have been easier for Georgiana to overcompensate, to prove remorse through constant presence or emotional labor. But she didn't. She let restraint do the speaking. That restraint became the foundation of trust. There was a day when Natalie realized she hadn't thought about guarding herself in Georgiana's presence for hours. The realization didn't surprise her. That was what surprised her. Safety had returned slowly, not because the past had been forgiven away, but because behavior had changed forward. Natalie began involving Georgiana in limited, defined ways, never emotionally, always practically, and Georgiana accepted those limits completely. Each interaction ended exactly where it was meant to. Nothing spilled, nothing lingered. One afternoon, while finalizing something small but important, Natalie paused and looked at her. "You're not trying to fix how I feel," Natalie said quietly. "And that matters." Georgiana didn't respond immediately. When she did, her voice was steady. "That's because your feelings aren't mine to manage," she said. "Only my actions are." That answer stayed with Natalie long after the conversation ended. It affirmed what she had sensed. Georgiana wasn't here to repair her own image. She was here to accept her lasting position in the story, whatever it became. Not closeness, not comfort, just responsibility. As weeks passed, the dynamics settled naturally. Natalie no longer rehearsed boundaries when Georgiana was involved. They existed without reinforcement. Trust hadn't been restored as it once was, but something more stable had formed. Respect. Richie observed all of this from a careful distance. He didn't evaluate it or label it. He didn't offer opinions unless asked, and that restraint mirrored Georgiana's. Natalie was surrounded now by people who didn't rush her healing forward, and that was new. One evening, Natalie reflected on the journey quietly, not with sadness, but with clarity. The harm had been real, the repair was deliberate, and the peace that followed wasn't fragile. She understood now that reconciliation didn't always mean return. Sometimes it meant transformation. Georgiana had changed her role fully, not by reclaiming friendship, but by choosing to become a dependable part of something she once destabilized. That distinction mattered. Natalie felt no obligation toward her. She felt no debt, but she felt supported, and that was enough. And for Georgiana, that knowledge settled deeply. She wasn't trying to be reaccepted. She was trying to be correct, and correctness maintained over time created its own quiet redemption, one that didn't ask to be celebrated. This turning point didn't arrive with emotion or closure. It arrived with consistency. And consistency, once established, changed everything that followed. The first time Natalie laughed without hesitation in Georgiana's presence, she noticed it immediately. It wasn't loud, it wasn't shared, it surprised her, and then it passed. But something about that moment mattered, not because pain was gone, but because it no longer dictated her reactions. Natalie understood then that healing doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself quietly, through moments that feel normal again before you even realize what has changed. What Georgiana had done, consistently, patiently, had created space, not pressure, not expectation, space. And space allowed Natalie to breathe without bracing. Natalie no longer felt the urge to revisit the harm every time they interacted. The past didn't need constant acknowledgement to remain valid. What mattered now was the present behavior. Georgiana remained careful. She never assumed access. She never initiated emotional conversations. When boundaries were implied, she respected them without discussion. That discipline spoke louder than anything she could have said. One afternoon, Natalie stood alone afterward, thinking about what accountability meant now, not as punishment, not as performance, but as alignment. Georgiana's actions lined up with the reality of the harm she had caused, and that alignment removed the tension Natalie had once carried. Not forgiveness, clarity. As for Georgiana, something inside her had settled as well. She no longer measured her worth by proximity to Natalie or validation from Richie. That season had ended. Her focus was singular: contribute honestly where allowed, disappear where not. There were moments of silence where regret still surfaced, but they didn't control her anymore. She had accepted that consequence wasn't something to escape, it was something to live with correctly. That acceptance matured her. Natalie noticed the shift in trust followed naturally. Then one evening, not during planning, not during conversation, Natalie said something small that meant everything. "I don't feel tense anymore." Georgiana looked up. "I'm glad," she replied. No follow-up, no grasping. Natalie let the words sit. It wasn't absolution, it wasn't permission, it was acknowledgement. And that felt complete. Richie sensed the change too. Natalie carried herself differently now, not guarded, not processing, simply present. He didn't ask questions. The answers were visible in her posture, her ease, her calm. The story between all three of them no longer felt unsettled. Georgiana had crossed a threshold, not into forgiveness, but into reliability. Natalie felt safe enough to stop reviewing the past. And that was the truest sign that repair had taken root. Nothing dramatic happened after that. And that was the point. The damage that once demanded attention no longer did. It had been addressed, not erased, not corrected, but carried properly. And carrying something properly over time transforms its weight. The shift became undeniable the day Natalie trusted Georgiana with something meaningful. It was practical, and that was what made it powerful. Natalie asked for her help with the detail that affected the future, not the past. Something forward-facing, something that mattered. Georgiana didn't pause. She didn't ask why. She didn't seek reassurance. She accepted the responsibility quietly and handled it with care. That moment closed a chapter, not because everything was repaired, but because Natalie no longer felt the need to protect what was already secure. Trust had returned in a new form, not blind, not unquestioning, but grounded. Georgiana followed through with precision. She anticipated challenges and resolved them without escalating concern. When difficulties arose, she asked for direction instead of making assumptions. When praise could have followed, she declined it. Utility over validation. Natalie felt the difference. This wasn't someone trying to rewrite their image. This was someone committed to doing things correctly, whether noticed or not. The ease between them reflected that. No emotional landmines, no cautious phrasing, just cooperation. Later that evening, Natalie reflected on what the day had represented. She realized Georgiana had transitioned fully out of the role of source of hurt. She was now simply someone present in Natalie's life in a limited, purposeful way. And that felt right. What surprised Natalie most was the absence of anxiety. She wasn't reclaiming the friendship that once existed, and she didn't want to. But she also wasn't carrying resentment forward anymore. She had chosen healing without compromise. Georgiana felt a similar quiet resolution. She no longer felt the urge to measure herself against the past or anticipate how others might perceive her involvement. Her role was clear. Serve the process, respect the space, exit when unnecessary. That clarity gave her peace. Richie, watching from the edge of this evolution, understood something important. True repair doesn't ask for forgiveness first. It earns trust through repeated alignment. Natalie hadn't softened because she was persuaded. She had softened because she felt safe again. And safety, once restored, doesn't need explanation. As this phase settled, Georgiana didn't feel like she was being allowed back in. She felt like she had finally stepped into the correct position. Not friend, not confidant, contributor, responsible. And that was enough. Natalie recognized the same truth. What had been broken had been addressed properly. And because of that, nothing else felt unfinished. The truth about the baby didn't arrive dramatically. There were no confrontations, no scenes meant to shock. It came the way real responsibility usually does, quietly and with intention. The man who was the baby's father had stayed on the edges for months, not out of avoidance, but out of respect for timing. He had watched the fallout from a distance, aware that stepping forward too early would add confusion instead of clarity. His absence wasn't denial, it was patience. When he finally reached out to Georgiana, it wasn't to make demands or explain himself. His message was simple, direct, and unguarded. "I need to be present in a way that doesn't cause harm," he said. "Tell me when it's right." That restraint mattered. Georgiana read the message slowly. She didn't feel relief. She felt responsibility sharpen. This wasn't about fixing the past. It was about acknowledging reality fully and correctly. They met without ceremony, neutral ground, no history attached to the place, no reason to revisit old emotions. He arrived calm, steady, and prepared, not to argue or defend, but to listen. "I never wanted chaos," he said plainly, "and I won't be part of it now." That statement set the tone. He didn't deny the past. He didn't minimize his role. He acknowledged that distance alone hadn't been enough. Stepping forward at the right time mattered more than remaining unseen. "I'm here to take responsibility in real terms," he continued. "Not emotionally dramatic ones." Georgiana believed him immediately, not because of words, but because of posture. There was no urgency in his voice, no pressure to forgive, reunite, or resolve anything on the spot, just presence. He spoke about the baby with clarity, not possession, not fear, care. "I want to be involved, consistently, quietly, correctly." Georgiana nodded. For the first time since everything began, the weight she carried shifted. Not because someone was rescuing her, but because someone was finally standing where they should have been all along. He didn't ask about the wedding. He didn't ask about Natalie or Richie. He didn't insert himself into outcomes that didn't involve him. That respect sealed something. When they parted that day, there was no renewed closeness yet, just alignment, a mutual understanding that responsibility wasn't about emotional repair first. It was about showing up properly. Later, when Georgiana told Natalie that the baby's father had come forward, she didn't frame it as resolution. She framed it as correctness. "He knows his place," she said simply, "and he's stepping into it." Natalie absorbed that information quietly, not with judgment, not with concern, with relief, because answers, when delivered calmly, release tension instead of creating more. This wasn't about finding a villain. It was about everyone assuming the right position, and for the first time, that was happening. Responsibility didn't change everything at once. It clarified things. The baby's father didn't arrive with promises meant to impress or reassurances designed to rush comfort. He arrived with consistency, the kind that doesn't fluctuate depending on emotion. He began adjusting his life immediately, not announcing changes, but making them. Work schedules shifted, living arrangements were reconsidered, practical details were handled before they were requested. Georgiana watched all of it quietly. She had spent months carrying assumptions, explanations, and fears alone. Now, she no longer had to imagine what responsibility might look like. She was watching it unfold in real time. They spoke often, calmly, directly, without revisiting what couldn't be altered. There was no blame exchanged between them. Neither tried to assign fault in a way that would reopen wounds. "What matters now is stability," he said once, "not revision." That sentence settled heavily, but safely. For Georgiana, this wasn't about being rescued. She remained fully accountable for what she had done. The presence of the baby's father didn't erase her choices. It simply meant she wasn't carrying parenthood alone. That distinction mattered. He understood her boundaries instinctively. He didn't press for closeness. He didn't attempt to redefine their past relationship immediately. "We don't need to name anything yet," he said. "We need to be present correctly first." That mirrored the discipline Georgiana had learned herself. Natalie learned more details gradually, always through Georgiana, never through rumor or explanation offered prematurely. The information arrived cleanly and without emotional framing. "The baby will be supported," Georgiana said. "Fully," Natalie nodded. She didn't need reassurance beyond that. The absence of drama was itself the resolution. Richie, too, acknowledged the clarity with quiet relief. It closed the final unanswered question, not emotionally but structurally. The confusion that once hung in the air dissipated because everyone was finally accountable for their own role. No overlap, no blurred lines, just truth standing where it belonged. As weeks passed, the rhythm between Georgiana and the baby's father became predictable. Shared planning, respectful communication, mutual cooperation. There were no arguments about ownership or authority. Each understood that showing up correctly was more important than asserting position. One evening, Georgiana realized something she hadn't expected. She felt calm, not resolved, not healed, but steady. That steadiness came from knowing that the future wasn't being imagined anymore. It was being actively supported. The sense of isolation she had once lived inside no longer defined her days. And for Natalie and Richie, this clarity allowed the final knot in the story to loosen. No one was guessing anymore. Everyone stood exactly where they should. What settled between Georgiana and the baby's father wasn't nostalgia. It was mutual maturity. They didn't pretend the past had been misunderstood or misread. They didn't reframe their earlier choices to make them gentler. There was no need to decorate what already existed. They spoke honestly, not about feelings they once had, but about the roles they now carried. "This isn't about fixing us," he said one afternoon. "It's about doing this right." And Georgiana agreed. They organized their lives around practicality rather than emotion. Appointments were scheduled together. Decisions were shared, not argued over. Each step forward was intentional, grounded in the understanding that stability mattered more than comfort. There was no tension in how they interacted. No unspoken grievances waiting to surface. The calm wasn't forced, it was earned. As time passed, Georgiana recognized something quietly changing. The sense of embarrassment she had lived with was fading, replaced by purpose, not pride, but direction. She was no longer reacting, she was choosing. Natalie noticed the shift, too. Georgiana spoke with clarity now, not defensiveness. She didn't seek reassurance or forgiveness. She relayed facts without emotional framing. "The baby is cared for," she said simply, "and the environment is steady." That was all Natalie needed to hear. For Richie, the knowledge brought closure without complication. There was no resentment lingering, no interest in revisiting details that no longer applied. The story had stopped circling. It was moving forward. One evening, Georgiana acknowledged something out loud for the first time. "I don't feel like I'm explaining myself anymore," she said. "I feel like I'm living responsibly." And that distinction mattered. The baby's father echoed the sentiment, not directly but through action. He stayed consistent without announcement. There were no declarations, no emotional gestures meant to prove commitment, just participation. That participation rewrote the future. There were no boundaries crossed between old dynamics and new realities. Everything was where it belonged now, Relationships existed in their correct form, without overlap or confusion. That correctness brought peace, and peace, unlike forgiveness, didn't require permission from anyone else. Georgiana stood firmly in her life now, not as someone defined by panic or regret, but as someone actively choosing responsibility. The questions people once asked silently disappeared. There was nothing left to explain. The reunion didn't look like reunion at all. There were no emotional declarations, no revisiting of what once almost was. What existed between Georgiana and the baby's father now was something steadier, mutual reliability grown from maturity, not nostalgia. They learned each other again, not through memory but through consistency. Conversations stayed grounded. Decisions were made together without competition or defensiveness. Neither of them tried to rewrite history in a softer light. They didn't need to. The past had already taught its lessons. What mattered now was how they spoke to one another, calm, direct, without emotional charge. That tone set the rhythm of everything that followed. One quiet evening, while reviewing plans for the coming months, the baby's father said something that anchored the direction of their connection. "I'm here long term," he said, not as a promise, as a practice. Georgiana didn't respond emotionally. She responded practically. "Then we do this carefully," she said, "for the child, for ourselves, without rushing into labels that don't serve stability." He agreed without hesitation. That agreement solidified something essential. This wasn't reconciliation driven by guilt or circumstance. It was partnership shaped by responsibility. Natalie learned about this shift in small pieces, never all at once. Georgiana didn't frame it as healing or redemption. She spoke plainly about shared logistics, consistent presence, structured planning. It reassured Natalie without asking for reassurance. "What you're doing matters," Natalie said once, not warmly, not coldly, just clearly. Georgiana nodded. "That's what I'm trying to do." Richie observed the same change from the outside. It closed the final unfinished space in the story. No ambiguity remained. Everyone was correctly placed. The absence of conflict was its own conclusion. The baby's father didn't compete for space. He didn't intrude into Natalie and Richie's rebuilding. He maintained respectful distance from relationships that weren't his to occupy. Everything stayed contained. Over time, naturally without announcement, Georgiana noticed something unfamiliar settle in. Stability, not excitement, not relief, stability. It wasn't glamorous. It wasn't soothing every day. But it was dependable, and that mattered more than emotion ever had. She didn't feel rescued. She felt supported. And support, when offered consistently and without condition, creates its own form of belonging. This chapter didn't close with resolution spoken aloud. It closed with alignment maintained. Closure didn't arrive as an announcement. It settled in gradually, through repetition and steadiness. By the time Georgiana realized it, there was nothing left unresolved. The baby had a present father, one who showed up without needing to be reminded, who planned instead of reacted, who understood that care was something proven through consistency rather than words. Georgiana herself felt anchored in a way she hadn't before, not because life had turned gentle, but because it had become clear. There were no competing truths anymore, no overlaps to manage, no fear pushing decisions ahead of wisdom. Everything finally matched reality. The responsibility she once tried to escape had transformed into purpose. The panic that had spoken too quickly at the wedding had no place in her life now. Every choice she made came from clarity instead of urgency. That change didn't go unnoticed. Natalie felt it most in what wasn't present anymore. No tension, no lingering uncertainty, no sense that the past might surface unexpectedly. Conversations about the future could happen without hesitation now, because the foundation beneath them was solid. Richie felt it too, though he rarely named it. There was peace in knowing that nothing was unresolved behind them. The story no longer carried loose ends that could return later. For Georgiana, the final moment of closure came quietly. One afternoon, watching the baby's father move naturally through responsibilities that had once terrified her, she understood something deeply. She was no longer defined by the worst thing she had done, not because it had been erased, but because it had been corrected through responsibility, not excuses. Later, when she spoke to Natalie, there was no emotional gravity in her words. "Everything's steady now," she said simply. Natalie believed her, not because she wanted to, but because it was true. There was nothing more to confront. No apology left unsaid, no role left unclaimed. Everyone stood exactly where they belonged, and that, finally, was closure. The second proposal didn't arrive with planning or performance. There was no countdown, no build-up meant to steer emotion. It happened on an ordinary afternoon, the kind of day that feels forgettable until it quietly changes everything. Natalie and Richie were together in the most unremarkable way. No special occasion, no deliberate setting, just shared time that felt easy, in the way only healed things can feel easy. They had been talking about nothing important, laughing softly, pausing without needing to fill space, and in that calm, Richie noticed something he hadn't needed to search for. Natalie was fully there. Not guarded, not measuring distance, not bracing herself, present. That presence mattered more than courage ever could. Richie didn't kneel immediately. He didn't rush the moment forward for impact. He stayed seated, turning slightly toward her, grounding himself before speaking. "I've thought about asking you again many times," he said. "Not because I wasn't sure, but because I wanted to be certain we were standing on solid ground." Natalie didn't interrupt. She didn't smile yet. She listened with openness, not caution. "I didn't want to ask you because we fixed things," he continued, voice steady. "I wanted to ask you because we changed." That distinction landed. Richie reached into his pocket slowly, not dramatically, not nervously. He placed the ring in his open palm between them, not offering it yet, just letting it exist where she could see it. This time he said, "I'm not asking out of hope. I'm asking because I trust us completely." Natalie let out a quiet breath, not surprise, not disbelief, recognition. She didn't look at the ring first. She looked at him. "This feels right," she said simply. Richie nodded. "It does." There was no speech rehearsed beyond that. Nothing poetic meant to perform commitment. He asked the question softly, almost naturally, like it belonged there. "Will you marry me?" Natalie didn't pause. She didn't search her feelings. She didn't check for fear. "Yes," she said immediately. "Certain." That certainty filled the space between them more powerfully than any dramatic response could have. Richie exhaled, the kind of breath someone doesn't realize they've been holding until they don't need to anymore. Natalie reached for him instinctively now, her hand warm and steady on his. "I'm not afraid of trusting you anymore," she said quietly, "because I know who you are, even when things aren't easy." That was the moment the audience would feel it. Not relief from tension, but release from doubt. Richie slipped the ring onto her finger without ceremony. No applause waited for them. No witnesses marked the moment. And that was perfect. Because this proposal wasn't about proving love survived. It was about honoring what love had become. They didn't announce it right away. After the second proposal, Natalie and Richie stayed exactly where they were, letting the moment settle without reaching for the future too quickly. There was no sudden rush to call family or text friends. No need to turn certainty into spectacle. Natalie kept looking at the ring, not with disbelief but with calm appreciation, like something that had finally returned to its rightful place. "This feels different," she said softly, more to herself than to him. Richie understood immediately. "It should," he replied. "We're different." They didn't talk about timelines or plans that afternoon. Instead, they spoke about how far they had come, not by revisiting pain but by recognizing growth. The things that once would have caused tension now felt manageable simply because they were no longer hidden. Trust didn't sound like reassurance anymore. It sounded like facts. Later that evening, Natalie did something small but meaningful. She took off the ring, cleaned it carefully and put it back on, not out of ritual but intention. "This isn't a promise I'm afraid to carry," she said. Those words mattered. For a long time, commitment had felt heavy to her, something that could shatter unexpectedly. Now it felt solid, not perfect, not guaranteed, but chosen. When they eventually told Natalie's parents, there was no shock, only relief. Not the dramatic kind, but the peaceful kind that comes when something finally makes sense. Her mother smiled softly. "I wondered when you'd find your way back to each other, the right way." That phrasing felt important, not back to the wedding, not back to the plan, back to each other. Richie told his family quietly as well. He didn't frame it as a second chance, he framed it as the right time. "We waited until honesty caught up with us," he said. That honesty changed the tone of every reaction that followed. No one questioned the decision. No one warned them to be careful, because how they stood beside each other now answered every concern without explanation. There was a peace in Natalie that people couldn't miss. She wasn't rushing forward or holding herself back. She moved with certainty, the kind that doesn't need defending. The proposal didn't reopen wounds. It closed a chapter without erasing it. And as the news settled quietly into their world, something shifted again, not outwardly but internally. For the first time, Natalie didn't think of the future with hesitation. She thought of it with readiness. The days that followed carried a gentler rhythm. Natalie noticed how certainty changed her habits. She stopped bracing before conversations, stopped rehearsing concerns. Trust wasn't something she was monitoring anymore. It was something she was living inside. Richie felt that shift immediately. The space between them held ease instead of tension. He didn't feel examined or tested. He felt welcomed. That difference allowed him to be present without self-consciousness. They talked more freely now, not about what might go wrong, but about what they wanted life to look like. Not a fantasy version, a practical one. "How do we keep this honest?" Natalie asked one evening. "We keep choosing clarity over comfort," Richie answered. Every time, that became their anchor. They didn't treat the second engagement like a correction. There was no narrative of fixing a mistake. They framed it as alignment finally meeting timing. Natalie said it best when someone asked how it felt. "It feels earned," she said, "not borrowed." The word resonated widely. Friends and family noticed how grounded they were. There was affection, but it wasn't frantic. Joy, but not loud. What stood out most was how little they explained themselves. They didn't need to. Love didn't feel like something that could be interrupted now. It felt steady, the kind that exists whether witnessed or not. One night as they sat together reviewing ordinary plans, Natalie paused. "You know what's different?" she asked. "What?" "I don't feel like I'm hoping anymore," she said. "I feel decided." Richie smiled gently. "That's how I feel too." The audience would feel it then. That quiet release. Not the rush of romance, but the deep relief of safety returning to love. The wedding they once imagined had been rooted in expectation. The wedding they were now planning would be grounded in truth. That distinction changed everything. Natalie felt confident saying yes because trust was no longer theoretical. It was observable, present in behavior, consistency, and humility. Richie didn't propose again to prove his devotion. He proposed because nothing stood in the way anymore. This wasn't redemption through romance. It was intimacy through honesty. Their love hadn't restarted. It had deepened. Planning this wedding felt nothing like the first. There was no pressure to impress, no pursuit of perfection, no sense that the event itself needed to prove anything about their love. Natalie noticed the difference immediately. The first time, every choice had carried weight. Colors, venues, schedules, expectations. This time, choices felt light. Not careless, but unburdened. They planned slowly, not because they were uncertain, but because there was no urgency driving them anymore. If something didn't feel right, they set it aside without debate. If an idea sparked joy, they kept it, not because it was grand, but because it felt personal, and that, more than anything, made this engagement feel real. Richie approached every decision with transparency. Nothing was assumed, nothing was handled without conversation. "I want this to feel like us," he said. Every part of it. Natalie believed him, not because he said it, but because that intention guided all of his actions. There was a moment, small but defining, when Natalie realized just how fully trust had returned. They were reviewing guest arrangements when something unexpected came up, a detail that would have embarrassed her once, something public-facing that tied back to the earlier wedding. Old Natalie might have tightened, prepared herself to manage discomfort. This Natalie didn't. She looked at Richie and said calmly, "Let's talk through it." And they did. No defensiveness, no hesitation, just problem solving. Afterward, Natalie sat back and smiled to herself, not because everything was easy, but because nothing felt threatening. That was the gift of healed trust. Their second wedding stopped being a redo and became something entirely different, a celebration shaped by understanding, not performance. It wasn't about reclaiming a moment, it was about honoring a journey. Friends noticed it too. The mood around planning was calm, open, even joyful. There was no frantic energy, no sense that anything could suddenly collapse. Natalie moved through the process with confidence. Richie moved through it with humility. Together, they moved at a pace that felt right. This wedding wasn't standing on hope, it was standing on clarity. And that clarity made every choice, big or small, feel secure. The emotional release came quietly, the way the deepest ones usually do. It arrived one evening when Natalie was standing alone, adjusting a small detail she had chosen for the ceremony. Nothing extravagant, nothing meant to impress. Just something that felt true to her. She paused, hand resting at her side, and felt a wave of certainty wash over her. No fear followed it, no doubt trailed behind it. Only peace. For so long, love had felt conditional, dependent on timing, transparency, and things staying intact. Now it felt steady on its own, no longer fragile or dependent on perfection. Richie entered the room and saw the look on her face. "You okay?" he asked. She turned and smiled softly. "I'm more than okay, I'm sure." That was the moment everything released, not just for Natalie but for the audience too. The tension that had been carried from part one, through confusion and consequence, finally exhaled. This wasn't a love story that survived denial. It was one that matured through truth. Natalie spoke the words out loud then, not dramatically, not as a vow, simply as a statement of fact. "I trust you," she said, "not because nothing went wrong, but because when it did, you stayed honest." Richie didn't answer immediately. He stepped closer, understanding the weight of what she had just given him. "That's the greatest gift I could ever receive," he said. There was no applause for this moment, no swelling language or grand declaration, but the significance landed deeper than any spectacle could have. This was love choosing itself again, consciously. The audience would feel it now, the satisfaction of resolution, the warmth of justice that didn't require punishment, and the relief of knowing that nothing had been left unresolved. Natalie hadn't compromised her values. Richie hadn't escaped accountability. Together, they had built something stronger than what they lost. And as plans continued quietly around them, it became clear that this second wedding wasn't a recovery. It was a reward, not for endurance, but for growth. Georgiana didn't step into the wedding planning as a favor. She stepped into it as responsibility given direction. When Natalie invited her into the process, it wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was simple, a clear boundary paired with a clear opportunity. "If you help," Natalie said calmly, "it has to come from care, not compensation." Georgiana understood immediately. "I wouldn't accept it any other way," she replied. From that moment on, Georgiana committed fully, not to control, not to recognition, but to excellence. She treated every detail as something worth honoring, not because it needed to erase the past, but because it deserved to stand confidently beyond it. She approached the work with precision and warmth, no rushing, no shortcuts, only intention. The venue became her first focus. She didn't approach it with grandeur in mind. She approached it with feeling. She visited places quietly, walking the spaces slowly, imagining what safety, joy, and openness would feel like there. When she finally brought options to Natalie, she presented them without attachment. "These are spaces where nothing echoes back," she said softly, "where the day can exist without carrying old weight." Natalie felt that immediately. Georgiana paid attention to the way light moved through rooms, how gatherings would flow naturally, how people might breathe easily there. She wasn't chasing impressiveness. She was building comfort. Next came intentions around decor, not trends, not obligation, but clarity. She listened carefully when Natalie spoke about what she once dreamed of and what had changed. "What still matters?" Georgiana asked gently. Natalie named colors she had loved quietly for years but once felt were too simple to choose. Georgiana wrote them down without question. "They'll be perfect," she said, and meant it. There was no defensiveness in Georgiana's presence, no need to prove value. She worked steadily behind the scenes, making thoughtful decisions, removing obstacles before they reached Natalie. And Natalie noticed something remarkable. There was no tension. This time, planning didn't feel like pressure or performance. It felt supported. For Georgiana, this wasn't rewriting history. It was contributing to something real, without asking to stand in the center of it. She wasn't trying to be redeemed. She was trying to be worthy of trust already given. And slowly, quietly, she became something unexpected, not the source of pain, but the quiet force ensuring this celebration would be full of peace. As planning moved forward, Georgiana became almost invisible in the best way. She didn't announce progress. She didn't seek approval after every decision. She worked quietly, checking details twice, anticipating needs before they were spoken aloud. Natalie noticed the difference immediately. There was a sense of ease this time. No tightening in her chest when choices came up. No second-guessing whether something would carry unwanted memories. The process flowed without resistance. Georgiana made sure of that. She spent long afternoons, speaking with vendors, not negotiating from pressure but from care. She didn't ask for discounts or favors. She asked for understanding. This day needs to feel open, she told them. Not heavy, not careful, just open. And somehow, they understood. When it came to colors, Georgiana was exacting. She didn't substitute, she didn't compromise. She searched until she found the precise shades Natalie had once described. Soft, warm, full of life. These are the ones, she said simply. Natalie held the samples in her hands and felt something unexpected. Excitement, without fear. That mattered. Decorations followed the same rule. Nothing sharp, nothing loud. Pieces were chosen for how they made a room feel, not how they would look in photos. Chairs arranged to encourage closeness. Tables spaced to allow movement. Lighting designed to make people relax their shoulders, not straighten their posture. Every detail served the same purpose: comfort. There was one small moment that stayed with Natalie. She had mentioned liking a particular flower long ago, something she never thought would fit a wedding. Georgiana remembered. "You said it made you feel calm," she said softly, offering the option without insistence. Natalie smiled. "I didn't think you'd remember that." "I remember what mattered," Georgiana replied. That response carried no weight of the past. It didn't ask for acknowledgement. It didn't seek forgiveness. It was simply true. Richie watched all of this unfold with gratitude and distance. He didn't oversee. He didn't interfere. He trusted the process because he trusted Natalie, and he trusted the intention behind Georgiana's work. This wasn't about compensation or correction. It was about contribution. And as the pieces came together, the atmosphere around the wedding shifted. This wasn't a celebration built around recovery. It was one built around confidence. And Georgiana, without ever stepping into the spotlight, was shaping that quietly from every corner. As the plans grew, Georgiana made one decision that guided everything else. Nothing would be small out of fear. When budgets were discussed, she didn't suggest scaling back to avoid attention. When spaces were reviewed, she didn't recommend quieter options to keep things safe. She refused to let hesitation dictate the shape of the day. "This shouldn't feel careful," she said calmly. "It should feel free." Natalie paused at those words. Free was exactly what the first wedding had never been. Georgiana noticed that too. She leaned into scale, not excess, but openness, wider spaces, bigger rooms filled with warmth instead of noise. Invitations designed to welcome, not impress. Music meant to lift, not overwhelm. "If people are going to witness your love," Georgiana said gently, "they should feel joy while doing it." Natalie felt something loosen in her chest. During one planning session, Natalie hesitated over a choice that once would have thrilled her, a detail she had dreamed of years ago but abandoned after the wedding collapsed. "That used to matter to me," she said softly. "I don't know if it should anymore." Georgiana looked at her without judgment. "Does it still make you smile?" she asked. Natalie nodded. "Then it still matters," Georgiana said. "Nothing beautiful needs to be punished for surviving." That sentence stayed with Natalie. It was the first time she realized the second wedding wasn't just allowed to exist, it was allowed to shine. Georgiana encouraged that shine deliberately. She didn't just approve ideas, she expanded them. If Natalie mentioned a thought quietly, Georgiana explored it fully. Bigger tables, longer music, more light. Not to be extravagant, but to be generous. "This isn't about rewriting a moment," Georgiana said later. "It's about creating one that can stand on its own." Richie noticed the difference immediately when he walked through early layouts. The space didn't feel guarded. It felt open. There was room for laughter, room for movement, room for being seen without pressure. Georgiana made sure nothing carried hesitation. No detail whispered apology. No corner held restraint. This wedding wouldn't tiptoe around the past. It would walk forward. and in choosing that direction so firmly, Georgiana made one thing clear: the lie that once overshadowed everything would not be the loudest voice in the room. Joy would be. As the planning deepened, something shifted in the way people spoke about the wedding, not with caution, not with curiosity, with anticipation. Georgiana noticed at first how conversations stopped orbiting the past and began focusing on what was coming, how voices lifted when dates were mentioned, how smiles came without hesitation. That mattered more than any checklist. She stayed grounded in her role, never stepping beyond what Natalie had allowed, but fully committed within it. If a decision needed reinforcement, she provided it quietly. If something felt unnecessary, she removed it without discussion. One evening, while reviewing the layout for the ceremony, Natalie paused mid-conversation. "This feels different," she said. Georgiana nodded. "Because it is." Natalie looked at her more closely now. "There's no fear in it," Natalie added. "That's not accidental," Georgiana replied. "Fear already had its moment. It doesn't get another." That was the first time Georgiana referenced the past directly, not defensively, not emotionally, just factually. And then she let it go. She made sure the ceremony itself would be expansive. Seating arranged to feel inclusive rather than formal. Space designed for movement, not rigidity. Nothing boxed in or overly structured. "This isn't a performance," she said. "It's a gathering." Natalie felt that distinction deeply. There was a moment later, while reviewing final decisions, when Natalie's voice caught slightly. "You don't have to do all this," she said. Georgiana's response was immediate, calm and clear. "I want to," she said, "and I want it to be unmistakably joyful." Natalie nodded, understanding exactly what was being offered. Not repayment, not penance, but participation rooted in responsibility. Georgiana wasn't trying to stand beside Natalie again in the way she once had. She was standing for her now, and that difference made everything feel safe. Richie saw it too. He didn't speak about it often, but he noticed how Natalie no longer carried tension during planning conversations. She wasn't bracing for disappointment or scrutiny. She was enjoying herself. That joy was earned. Georgiana stayed consistent. Every vendor interaction, every decision, every adjustment reflected the same intention. This wedding would not be defined by care or caution. It would be defined by warmth. And slowly, another truth became clear. Georgiana wasn't just helping plan the wedding. She was protecting its atmosphere. There was a moment that changed everything. It happened late one evening, long after most decisions had been handled and the room had fallen quiet. Natalie and Georgiana sat across from each other, paperwork spread out but forgotten. Natalie leaned back and exhaled. "This feels bigger than I imagined," she said softly. Not louder, just fuller. Georgiana looked at her carefully before answering. "That's because you're not shrinking it anymore," she said. "You're not editing joy to make it safer." Natalie felt the truth of that settle in her chest. For so long, happiness had felt like something fragile, something that might invite loss if it became too visible. This time, Georgiana wasn't allowing that instinct to shape anything. "If this wedding is going to mean anything," Georgiana continued, choosing her words with care, "it should speak louder than the lie ever did." The words landed, not as drama, but as release. Natalie didn't respond immediately. She simply nodded, eyes soft but steady. That sentence became a guiding principle. From that point on, Georgiana leaned fully into generosity, more light, more space, more openness. She ensured every corner of the celebration carried intention, not restraint. She encouraged laughter during planning meetings. She welcomed ideas that felt joyful even if they weren't practical at first. She filtered every suggestion through one question. Does this add peace or pressure? If it added pressure, it was gone. People noticed. Vendors smiled more. Conversations lingered. Planning sessions ended with warmth instead of exhaustion. Natalie no longer felt like she was managing her own happiness. She was inhabiting it. Richie sensed this shift deeply. He watched Natalie move through preparations with ease rather than tension, her excitement unguarded, her anticipation free of fear. He recognized something important. This wedding wasn't healing the past, it was outgrowing it. And Georgiana stood at the center of that transformation, not drawing attention to herself, not seeking forgiveness, simply making sure joy was protected at every turn. The wedding was becoming something unmistakable, not careful, but confident. As the date drew closer, Georgiana took on a role no one had assigned her, guardian of the mood. Not the schedule, not the spotlight, the mood. She noticed when Natalie grew tired and stepped in, before fatigue turned into overwhelm. She intercepted decisions that didn't need Natalie's input. She filtered conversations so nothing careless or unnecessary reached her. "This is your joy," Georgiana told her once. "You're allowed to protect it." That sentence mattered. For the first time, Natalie felt permission not just to be happy, but to stay happy. Georgiana became intentional about moments others might overlook. She planned quiet pauses into the day, spaces where Natalie and Richie could breathe without attention, transitions that felt smooth instead of hurried. This wasn't control. It was care. When emotions surfaced unexpectedly, a memory stirred, a comparison made, Georgiana didn't rush in with reassurance. She grounded the moment. "Different doesn't mean fragile," she said calmly. Natalie believed her. One afternoon, as Georgiana reviewed final arrangements alone, she recognized something in herself that hadn't existed before. Peace, not relief, not pride. Peace. She wasn't trying to repair her place in Natalie's life anymore. She wasn't measuring whether she had done enough. She was simply doing what needed to be done. Fully, cleanly, without expectation. That clarity changed how she moved. When people complimented her work, she redirected the focus gently. When appreciation was offered publicly, she shifted attention back to Natalie. "This day is about love," she said. "Let's keep it there." The closer they got, the more obvious it became. This wedding wasn't built to outrun the past. It was built to stand taller than it. Natalie felt it every time she entered a space Georgiana had shaped. There was no tension waiting for something to go wrong. No sense that joy required guarding. Joy was being protected for her. Richie saw it too. He recognized the care layered into every detail, not showy, not dramatic, but thoughtful. He understood that what Georgiana was offering went beyond apology. It was stewardship, and stewardship, practiced consistently, earns trust without demanding it. As the final preparations settled into place, one thing was undeniable. Georgiana had become the quiet center holding everything steady. Not because she demanded attention, because she refused to let fear have any. The week of the wedding arrived without chaos. That alone felt miraculous. Instead of frantic calls and last-minute panic, there was rhythm. Tasks landed where they were meant to. Timing held. People showed up prepared. Georgiana moved through it all with a steady presence that calmed everyone around her. Vendors, family, even strangers who didn't know the history but could feel the harmony. Natalie noticed something subtle that week. She wasn't bracing herself. No tight shoulders when her phone rang. No sharp inhale before entering a room. No private rehearsals of what she might say if something went wrong. She was present. That was new. One afternoon, while final measurements were being adjusted, Natalie sat quietly with her hands folded, watching Georgiana address a detail about lighting placement. The scene struck her unexpectedly. There was no tension between them now, no careful wording, no need to monitor emotional distance, just trust. That realization brought Natalie to tears, not sudden, not dramatic, but slow and quiet. The kind that catches you off guard because you didn't know you were carrying anything still that heavy. Georgiana noticed immediately. She didn't rush over. She didn't ask questions. She simply came closer and stood beside her. "Still okay?" she asked gently. Natalie nodded. More than okay. Later that evening, when the planning space emptied and only boxes remained stacked neatly against the walls, Georgiana stayed behind to double-check everything one last time. Not because she distrusted the work, because she cared enough to be certain. As she locked up, she paused, keys in hand, and allowed herself a moment to reflect. This wasn't redemption earned through applause. This was redemption practiced through consistency. Meanwhile, Richie watched Natalie from across the room during a quiet gathering with close family. She laughed freely, shoulders relaxed, eyes bright in a way he hadn't seen since before everything broke. He didn't take credit for that. He knew healing hadn't come from grand gestures or forced reassurance. It had come from allowing truth, patience, and presence to do their work. That night, Richie thanked Georgiana quietly as they walked out together. "You didn't owe us this," he said. Georgiana stopped and met his gaze. "I owed myself honesty," she replied. This is what that looks like." They stood there for a moment, understanding settling fully into place. As the final days ticked down, the wedding no longer felt like a second attempt at something lost. It felt like the natural continuation of something worth protecting, and for the first time, every person involved knew exactly where they stood. No guessing, no pretending, no fear left to speak. The night before the wedding, Georgiana couldn't sleep, not because of nerves, not because of worry, but because her mind was full in a quiet, meaningful way. She sat alone at the kitchen table, wedding materials spread out in gentle order, seating charts aligned, ribbon samples folded neatly, a handwritten checklist marked completely full. There was nothing left to fix, and that too felt new. She thought about how different everything felt this time, not rushed, not fragile, not built on everyone hoping nothing would go wrong. This wedding wasn't being held together by optimism, it was being held together by truth. Earlier that evening, Natalie had come by unexpectedly, no announcement, no formal reason, just a knock at the door. They stood there for a moment, face to face, each realizing the significance of how ordinary it felt now. Natalie stepped inside and looked around the spread of preparations. "You really saw everything through," she said quietly. Georgiana nodded. "I wanted it to feel complete." "It does," Natalie replied. Then, after a pause, she added, "So do I." That sentence stayed with Georgiana long after Natalie left. Now, sitting alone, she finally allowed herself to feel something she hadn't permitted before. Peace. Not the kind that comes from forgetting. The kind that comes from accountability finally settling into place. She knew tomorrow wouldn't erase the past. It didn't need to. The past had already done its work, redirecting them all toward something truer. Georgiana stood, turned off the light, and paused at the doorway before heading to bed. She whispered to the empty room, not as a prayer, not as a promise, just as a truth spoken aloud. Let this day speak louder than what once hurt, and for the first time since everything began, she believed it would. Morning arrived gently, not rushed, not sharp. Sunlight touched the room as if it had learned patience, spreading slowly across the floor, warming things instead of waking them abruptly. Georgiana was already up. She moved through the house quietly, making coffee no one needed yet, straightening things that didn't require fixing. Not out of anxiety, but habit. The kind that comes from caring deeply about how a day begins. When Natalie arrived later, dressed simply, hair loose, no rush in her steps, Georgiana noticed something immediately. She wasn't bracing. She wasn't guarded. She looked present. They sat together briefly, sharing coffee without filling the space with talk. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It was companionable, safe. Natalie broke it first. "You know," she said softly, "this doesn't feel like a redo." Georgiana looked up. "It feels like a continuation." Georgiana smiled. Not in relief, not in pride, but in understanding. "That's what I hoped," she said. "I didn't want it to feel like we were fixing something. I wanted it to feel like we were choosing it." Natalie nodded. "That's exactly what it feels like." Outside, people began arriving. Quiet bustle, soft voices, laughter that carried without pressure. The energy wasn't anxious, it was steady. Georgiana stepped back as things moved forward, letting others take over. She didn't need to direct anymore. Everything had been set with care and intention. It could breathe on its own now. As Natalie was called away to prepare, she stopped at the doorway and turned back. "There's something I want you to know," she said. Georgiana waited. "You didn't just help plan a wedding," Natalie continued. "You helped restore my sense of safety around joy." Georgiana felt emotion rise, but she kept her voice even. "Then it was worth every moment." Natalie smiled, not small, not cautious, but full, and as she walked away, Georgiana felt the final piece click into place. This wasn't about redemption. It was about transformation. The wedding ahead would be bright. It would be warm. It would be beautiful. But more than anything, it would be honest. The house filled slowly, the way good news usually does. Not all at once, not loudly, but steadily, with familiar voices, footsteps that didn't hesitate, and greetings that sounded warm instead of careful. Natalie stood in the living room as family members arrived. and for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she needed to prepare herself emotionally for their faces. There were no tight smiles, no sideways glances, no questions held back out of fear. Her mother adjusted a vase on the table and smiled openly. An aunt pulled her into a hug without whispering. Cousins chatted easily, laughing about traffic, about food, about ordinary things. Normal had returned. Not forced normal, healed normal. Natalie noticed it most in herself. Her shoulders weren't raised, her hands weren't clasped together. She wasn't scanning the room for danger or discomfort. She moved freely. In the kitchen, Richie stood with her father, sleeves rolled up, quietly helping where needed. There was no stiffness between them. The kind of silence they shared wasn't avoidance, it was familiarity restored. Her father clapped Richie on the back lightly at one point and said, "Looks like we'll need more chairs." Richie smiled. "I'll handle it." That simple exchange carried more healing than any long conversation ever could. Across the room, Georgiana stood slightly apart, not because she was unwelcome, but because she understood where her presence belonged now. And even from that distance, she could see it clearly. Whatever tension once existed here was gone. Natalie felt it too. She caught her reflection briefly in a window pane and paused, surprised by what she saw. She wasn't bracing, she wasn't holding herself together, she was glowing, not from excitement alone, but from ease. This moment mattered, because weddings are often measured by appearances, dresses, flowers, decorations. But this one was being measured by something far more important: peace. Every laugh that echoed through the house sounded earned. Every smile felt intentional. Every shared look carried trust, not because nothing hard had happened, but because what happened had been faced fully. Natalie inhaled slowly. Joy no longer felt like a risk, and that was how she knew they were ready. By mid-morning, the house had transformed, not in decoration but in energy. Music drifted in softly from someone's phone on the counter. Shoes were kicked off near the doorway. Conversations overlapped naturally, without the careful pauses that once filled every gap. Friends who had once been unsure of what to say now moved with comfort again. One of Natalie's closest friends brushed past her with a grin. "You're calm," she said, almost surprised. "Like, actually calm." Natalie laughed lightly. "I am," and she meant it. There had been a time when preparation felt like pressure, like standing at the edge of something fragile, hoping not to jostle it. Today felt different. Nothing about this day felt delicate. It felt grounded. In a quiet corner, two friends who had avoided each other for months found themselves talking easily now, reminiscing about college days, about road trips and inside jokes that had survived everything. Healing didn't arrive with announcements. It arrived with familiarity returning. In another room, Georgiana helped adjust a small family photo display. She worked quietly, respectfully, never inserting herself, never withdrawing, just present in the way someone is when they understand the weight of belonging. Natalie noticed. Their eyes met briefly across the room. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The tension that once existed between them had softened into something steadier, not the same as before, but honest. That honesty shaped the atmosphere. People felt it. No one whispered. No one tiptoed. No one watched Natalie like she might break. They treated her like someone who had walked through fire and come out stronger. In the hallway, Richie passed Natalie, paused, then gently reached for her hand. She didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She squeezed his hand once, simple, sure. That small gesture anchored him more than any speech ever could. He looked at her then, not with relief, not with fear, but with quiet certainty. They didn't need reassurance anymore. They had evidence. Evidence in the way laughter flowed. Evidence in the way shoulders relaxed. Evidence in the way love no longer felt like something that needed defending. Only continuation. And that realization settled over the room. Subtle, unspoken, undeniable. This wasn't a celebration trying to outrun the past. It was a gathering that had made peace with it. Later in the afternoon, the rhythm of the day slowed, not due to fatigue but comfort. Natalie drifted toward the yard, drawn by sunlight and open space. A few chairs had been set out casually, drinks resting on the grass beside them. Her mother sat with two relatives, talking easily, their conversation weaving between memories and plans, without ever circling back to old pain. Natalie joined them for a moment, listening more than speaking. She noticed something quietly profound. No one looked at her with concern anymore. They looked at her with pride. One of her aunts leaned over and said, "You seem lighter." Natalie smiled. "I feel clear." That was the word that fit best. Not excited, not guarded, clear. She stood again, walking slowly across the yard, aware of her surroundings without feeling overwhelmed by them. Every detail felt present but not heavy. The warmth on her skin, the low hum of conversation behind her, the simple fact that nothing in this moment needed managing. Inside the house, Richie sat with a few friends he hadn't seen since before everything unfolded. At first, the conversation stayed safe. Work, weather, ordinary events. Then someone mentioned the upcoming ceremony with an ease that would have felt impossible months earlier. Richie didn't tense. He didn't deflect. He simply nodded. "We're ready," he said calmly, and surprising himself, he meant more than just readiness for the event. He was ready for the life beyond it, not a performance of happiness, but a lived one. Natalie returned inside as laughter broke out near the kitchen. Someone had told a childhood story, harmless, affectionate, and Natalie found herself laughing freely, without replay, without restraint. That was how she knew something fundamental had shifted. She wasn't scanning her joy for danger. She wasn't checking her emotions for cracks. She was simply allowing happiness to exist. Georgiana stood nearby, watching the room with quiet attentiveness. She didn't center herself, didn't search for acknowledgement. Her presence was intentional, but light. Natalie caught herself appreciating that, not because it erased what once went wrong, but because it honored how much had gone right since. When Natalie passed her, Georgiana spoke softly. "You look peaceful," she said. Natalie stopped. "So do you." The exchange didn't linger. It didn't need to. Trust was no longer something they were negotiating. It was something that had returned naturally, shaped by effort rather than expectation. That evening, as the house settled into a comfortable stillness, Natalie looked around one last time before stepping away to prepare. She felt no urge to escape the moment, no fear of what came next, only presence. And that presence, calm, grounded, unforced, became the quiet proof that healing had completed the work it started. As evening approached, the mood shifted again, not into anticipation, but into reassurance. Dinner was informal, plates balanced on knees, people moving in and out of conversations freely. Someone played music low in the background, nothing meant for ceremony, just something familiar enough to hum along to. Natalie sat beside Richie without thinking twice about it. The ease of that small fact surprised her. There had been a time when every shared moment felt like it required evaluation, weighing what it meant, what it suggested, what it risked. Now, sitting beside him felt uncomplicated, real. Richie noticed it too, though he said nothing. He didn't reach for her hand constantly. He didn't ask if she was okay. He had learned that checking too often could pull someone out of peace instead of supporting it. Instead, he stayed present. When someone asked a logistical question, he answered calmly. When laughter erupted, he joined without hesitation. His body language no longer carried apology. It carried acceptance of the past, of responsibility, of the present. Across the table, Natalie's father watched the two of them quietly for a moment. Later, when Richie stood to clear plates, he spoke in a voice meant only for Richie to hear. "You're steady," he said. Richie paused. "I try to be. That's all anyone can ask," her father replied. Those words stayed with Richie long after the conversation moved on. Natalie noticed the way her family interacted with Richie now. Open, normal, unguarded. No one was testing him. No one was keeping score. They weren't choosing denial. They were choosing recognition. As the gathering thinned and people began to head home, there were long hugs instead of quick ones, gentle reminders to rest, genuine excitement for the next day, voiced without hesitation. No one spoke in low tones. No one avoided eye contact. When Natalie finally stood alone near the doorway, watching the last guests leave, she felt something settle into place. There was no loose thread pulling at her chest. The relationships around her weren't fragile anymore. They were healed enough to hold weight. And as Richie joined her, standing close but not pressing in, Natalie realized something important. This wasn't about forgiveness alone. It was about trust returning in ways that didn't need to announce themselves. That return, quiet, earned, and complete, was the strongest preparation of all. The night ended without ceremony. No final speech, no emotional goodbye, just people leaving slowly, reluctant to break the sense of calm that had settled over everything. Natalie stood at the window after the door closed behind the final guest, watching headlights fade down the street. The house felt full without feeling crowded, warm without being loud. She turned and leaned back against the wall, exhaling deeply. Richie noticed and joined her, standing at a respectful closeness. "You okay?" he asked gently. Natalie smiled. "Better than okay." She meant it in a way that surprised even her. There was no knot in her chest, no sense of waiting for something else to go wrong, no urge to revisit old conversations in her mind. She felt complete in this moment. They stood together in silence for a bit, not filling it, not examining it. Richie nodded. "That's exactly how it feels." He didn't add qualifiers. He didn't lower his voice like happiness might be fragile. Natalie looked at him then, really looked. Not at the man she had once almost married. Not at the man who had made mistakes, but at the man standing here now, steady, present, fully himself. She reached for his hand without hesitation. It wasn't dramatic. It didn't need to be. That simple gesture closed a circle neither of them had rushed to complete. Outside, the street remained quiet. Inside, the house held on to warmth, not the temporary kind, but the kind that stays. This was what healing looked like in real time. No tension, no fear, no unfinished business. Just two people standing in peace, ready for what came next. Not because they had erased the past, but because they had faced it fully and chosen to move forward together. And as the lights dimmed and the house settled into rest, one truth remained undeniable. This time, love wasn't asking for bravery. It was offering rest. The morning of the wedding arrived without urgency. Not because it wasn't important, but because everything that could have rushed this moment already had once before. This time, nothing needed to be forced. Light filtered into the space steadily, touching fabric, faces, quiet smiles. There were no last-minute doubts hovering in corners. No pacing, no whispered worries. Natalie stood near the window while she finished getting ready, her breath slow, her movements unhurried. This wasn't the walk toward a promise she hoped would hold. It was the walk toward a life she had already chosen. Outside, the venue came alive gradually. Guests arrived smiling, not curious. There was no sense of people gathering to witness something fragile. They were there to celebrate something solid. Music drifted easily through open air. Flowers were placed not as decoration alone, but as intention. Every detail had weight, not because it was extravagant, but because it was deliberate. This wedding wasn't built to impress. It was built to affirm. Natalie took a moment to herself before stepping forward. She didn't close her eyes to steady herself. She didn't rehearse courage. She simply stood, fully present. When the doors opened, the space shifted, not into silence, into attention. She walked forward with calm confidence, her posture relaxed, her expression open. There was no tremor in her step, no catching her breath. Across the aisle, Richie waited, not tense, not searching her face for reassurance. He wasn't holding his breath. He was breathing with her. What surrounded them wasn't spectacle. It was warmth. Friends leaned forward with smiles that weren't cautious. Family members exchanged glances that spoke of relief, pride, and joy without reserve. This wasn't about proving anything. It was about honoring what had survived. Georgiana sat among them, not hidden, not center stage, present with humility and happiness. There was no envy in her expression, no distance, only gratitude. She watched Natalie with genuine admiration, understanding something deeply now. Some love stories don't restart, they mature. As Natalie reached the front, she met Richie's eyes and smiled, a smile that didn't ask for certainty, it offered it. The officiant spoke, but the meaning had already filled the space before a single vow was shared. This wasn't the wedding they once planned. It was the one that reflected who they had become, and everyone there could feel it. As the ceremony continued, there was a subtle shift, not in atmosphere, but in focus. This was no longer a moment about recovery, it was about presence. Natalie stood with her hands relaxed at her sides, shoulders steady, her attention fully on the man before her. Richie mirrored that quiet composure. Nothing about their posture suggested nerves. What they shared didn't require rehearsal. The officiant spoke about choice. Not destiny, not fate, choice, about waking up and deciding again and again to show up honestly, even when it's uncomfortable, even when it costs pride. The words weren't abstract, they were lived. When it came time for vows, Natalie didn't rush. She didn't search for the right line. She spoke plainly. "I choose you," she said, her voice clear. "Not because it's easy, but because it's true. I choose you knowing who you are today, not who I once imagined you to be." There was no applause yet, no interruption, just stillness, the kind that signals understanding rather than suspense. Richie nodded slightly before responding. "I stand here without promises I can't keep," he said, "but with commitment that I already have. I choose honesty over comfort, you over fear." His voice didn't waver. It didn't need to. This wasn't about grand declarations. It was about alignment. Around them, listeners leaned closer, not out of drama, but recognition. These weren't generic vows. They reflected a path many had walked, quietly, imperfectly. Georgiana listened intently from her seat, hands folded, eyes bright with emotion. Nothing in this moment felt like consequence for her. It felt like closure, joyful closure. She smiled when Natalie spoke of trust, when Richie acknowledged growth, not because she was part of it, but because she understood the cost. The room didn't feel formal. It felt sincere. When rings were exchanged, there was no echo of the past, just affirmation. And when the officiant announced them ready to move forward, the space held its breath for a fraction of a second longer, not in doubt, in celebration. The ceremony was becoming more than an event. It was becoming a declaration of what love looks like when it returns wiser. When the officiant finally spoke the closing words, something remarkable happened. Applause didn't come immediately. There was a pause, brief, natural, as if everyone present needed half a breath to fully understand what they had just witnessed. Not a reunion built on denial, not romance powered by forgetting, but love standing firmly on truth. Then the sound rose, not polite clapping, not hesitant approval, real applause, the kind that carries relief, pride, and joy all at once. Natalie smiled, and this time it wasn't restrained. It reached her eyes, spread across her face, softened her entire posture. Richie felt at the instant she turned toward him, that unmistakable energy of two people finally arriving at the same moment together. They stepped forward, hands intertwined, not rushing, not posing for effect. The applause followed them like a wave, swelling as people rose instinctively to their feet. This wasn't just a wedding, it was validation. Validation that love can pause without dying, that honesty can hurt without destroying, that trust, once rebuilt, can be stronger than it ever was before. Georgiana stood as well, clapping with genuine warmth. There was no awkwardness in her movement, no hesitation. Her expression carried something gentle and proud. She had witnessed love come full circle, and she knew, truly knew, that her presence here belonged. As Natalie and Richie reached the end of the aisle, they stopped for just a second, turning back to take it all in. Not because they needed the moment to last, but because they wanted to acknowledge it. Their faces said everything words didn't need to. "Thank you, we're here, we made it honestly." The music swelled again, brighter now, celebratory without feeling overwhelming. Laughter joined the applause. Tears were wiped discreetly. This was the release everyone had been carrying. For listeners, for witnesses, for those who had followed the story from its painful beginning, this was the payoff. Not perfection, but peace, achieved together. Once the ceremony concluded, the energy shifted from reverence to celebration, smoothly, naturally, without anyone needing to prompt it. Music welcomed people into movement. Conversations bloomed immediately, not cautious, not staged. Guests embraced Natalie and Richie with confidence, as if this union had already been affirmed long before today. Natalie moved through the crowd comfortably, no tight grip on Richie's hand, no signs of overwhelm. She laughed freely, hugged without hesitation, accepted congratulations as something she deserved, rather than something she needed to protect. Richie stayed close, not out of insecurity, but out of choice. He moved with ease, greeting family members who now welcomed him openly. There were warm looks, firm handshakes, quiet nods that carried meaning without needing explanation. This wasn't approval earned in a moment. It was trust recognized over time. Georgiana stood near the edge of the gathering for a while, giving space, honoring the moment without inserting herself into it. When Natalie eventually found her, there was no tension in the approach, only familiarity. Natalie held Georgiana's hands gently. "Thank you," she said simply. Georgiana swallowed, but her voice stayed steady. It was a privilege, no defensiveness, no reminders of the past, as gently. "Thank you," she said simply. Georgiana swallowed, but her voice stayed steady. It was a privilege, no defensiveness, no reminders of the past, just shared awareness of what had been walked through together. As guests took their seats and the reception unfolded, laughter filled the space easily. Stories were shared lightly. Plates clinked, glasses lifted. This celebration didn't feel like it was making up for anything. It felt like continuity. For the audience listening, this was the moment they'd been waiting for without even realizing it. The moment words weren't needed anymore. The joy unfolding in front of them was complete, not because it erased pain, but because it proved pain had not ruined the possibility of something beautiful. Love hadn't returned timidly. It had returned ready. As the evening progressed, the celebration found its rhythm, effortless, unforced, genuine. Natalie and Richie shared their first dance without choreography, without performance. There was no need to impress anyone. They moved together the way people do when they trust the space between them, close, comfortable, certain. Natalie rested her hand easily on Richie's shoulder, her head tilted slightly toward him, her smile relaxed. Richie held her with quiet assurance, not tightly, not cautiously, but with presence. Guests watched with warmth, not expectation. This wasn't a moment people analyzed. They felt it. Across the room, Georgiana stood beside relatives and friends, laughing softly, participating without hesitation. When her eyes met Natalie's across the floor, she lifted her glass slightly in a gesture that felt like gratitude rather than pride. Natalie returned the gesture with a nod that carried mutual respect. Music shifted. The dance floor filled. Joy didn't arrive all at once. It layered itself gradually. Conversations blended with laughter. Old stories were told without heaviness. New memories formed without pressure to compete with the past. Richie leaned close to Natalie and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me again." She didn't answer right away. She looked at him, her expression open and sure. "I never stopped," she said softly. "I just needed time." That honesty mattered. No disguises, no rewriting history, just acknowledgement of growth. As the night deepened, the mood only grew lighter. Children laughed freely. Elders watched contentedly. Friends danced with abandon. This wasn't celebration born from relief alone. It was celebration born from alignment. And for those listening following every chapter of this journey, this moment delivered something powerful. Not fantasy, not perfection, but reconciliation that felt earned, and love that stood confidently in the open. As the night settled, the celebration slowed into something softer, deeper. The music lowered. Conversations drew closer. The kind of quiet joy that arrives after everything meaningful has already been said began to take hold. Natalie stood at the edge of the space for a moment, watching the people she loved move freely. Her family relaxed, her friends laughing without restraint. Richie speaking easily with those who once watched him with caution. Nothing felt unfinished. Richie joined her, slipping his hand into hers naturally. "This feels different," he said. "It is," Natalie replied without hesitation. "We're not asking for permission anymore." They leaned together slightly, content in the stillness that followed. Nearby, Georgiana caught their attention and approached, not hurried, not hesitant. She stopped just far enough to honor their space. "I won't take long," she said gently. "I just wanted to say, watching you today reminded me of something important." Natalie waited. "Love survives best when it's chosen freely," Georgiana continued. "Thank you for letting me be part of this chapter." Natalie reached for her hand. "Thank you for honoring it." No tears followed, no long speeches, only sincerity. As the final song played, guests gathered closer, arms around one another, faces glowing. There was no performance left, just connection. When Natalie and Richie finally stepped away together, hand in hand, the applause that followed wasn't loud. It was meaningful. And as they moved forward, not toward an ending, but into the life they had reclaimed honestly, one truth remained clear to everyone listening. Love doesn't always return the same. Sometimes it returns stronger because it chose truth over fear and connection over silence. The reception didn't begin with formality. It began with laughter, the kind that comes from relief finally giving way to joy, unguarded, natural, effortless. Conversations overlapped, music moved gently through the space, and no one felt the need to check themselves emotionally. Natalie noticed it first in her body. Her shoulders weren't tense, her breath wasn't shallow, she wasn't scanning faces or reading meanings into moments. She was simply present. She leaned into Richie during dinner, laughing softly as he teased her about the way she always saved the best part of the meal for last. It was an old habit, one she hadn't realized she missed until now. Richie felt it too. He wasn't bracing for questions. He wasn't proving anything. He wasn't apologizing with his posture. He was relaxed. For the first time since the day everything broke open, he felt allowed to enjoy the moment without guilt trailing behind him. Not because the past had been erased, but because it had been faced fully and left where it belonged. They danced again later, not because it was expected, but because they wanted to, this time surrounded by people who were smiling freely, not watching carefully. Natalie laughed mid-dance, her head tilting back slightly. "This feels easy," she said. Richie nodded. "That's how I know it's real." Across the room, Georgiana stood quietly watching the joy unfold. She didn't interrupt it. She didn't insert herself into it. She simply smiled, deeply, genuinely. There was no longing in her expression, no regret demanding attention, only knowledge. She had damaged something once, seeing Natalie at peace, seeing Richie grounded, seeing love return stronger instead of smaller. That was enough. She lifted her glass once, softly, almost to herself, not in celebration of attendance, in gratitude for restoration. As the night carried on, the room remained warm with connection. Guests lingered, children laughed. Music softened instead of ending sharply. There was no rush to close the night, because nothing felt unfinished. Natalie stepped back briefly, just for a moment, to take it all in. Not the decorations, not the lights, the feeling. She returned to Richie and slipped her hand into his without thinking. He tightened his fingers around hers automatically. No fear, no doubt. Just shared stillness inside joy. And as the reception slowly transitioned from celebration to memory, one thing was unmistakable. Happiness had settled, not loudly, but deeply. It was never about a wedding interrupted, and it was never about a lie as much as it was about what silence can do when it replaces courage. Love does not survive secrecy. It survives truth, even when truth arrives late, even when it hurts, even when it changes everything. What nearly ended Natalie and Richie wasn't betrayal. It was withheld reality, and what saved them wasn't proof alone. It was accountability. Redemption wasn't spoken into existence in this story. It was earned through restraint, honesty, patience, and the willingness to rebuild without demanding outcomes. Georgiana didn't restore what she damaged by asking for forgiveness. She restored it by choosing responsibility again and again, until her actions spoke louder than her mistake ever did. And Natalie's healing didn't come from erasing the past. It came from choosing herself first, and choosing love again only when it was safe, honest, and mutual. That's the lesson. Silence can destroy relationships quietly, but courage can restore them completely. Not every story ends with loss, and not every happy ending comes quickly. Some endings are earned slowly, through truth, through effort, and through people deciding to do better than before. If you stayed with this story from the beginning, if you waded through the confusion, if you questioned, doubted, hoped, and kept listening, was the wait worth it? Let me know in the comments. Your thoughts matter here. And if this story reminded you that love can survive mistakes when honesty leads the way,